Hi, I'm Mitch, and welcome to the Restoration Road, where my guest today is Donnie Foster. Donnie's book, Face Down, is one of the most riveting pieces of literature I've ever read. Donnie's story of being abused and addiction and in and out of federal penitentiaries is a tough one to hear. But all the while, God's hand was on Donnie, inviting him to a fully surrendered relationship with the God of the universe in Jesus Christ. Donnie's very transparent and open and authentic. And so listen to this amazing story of how God took a mess and made it a message. How he took someone's test and made it a testimony. And he wants to do the same for you. Donnie, thank you so much for being with us today.
Thanks for having me.
I read your book. I could not put it down. It was riveting. I think it should be a full-length feature film. It could be more than one film. And I want everybody to hear all these amazing things that God has brought you through. But before we get started, I'd like you to talk about Misfits and the verses on your hat.
Misfits is a homeless ministry here in Fort Wayne, Indiana. It was started 13 plus years ago. I've heard from God say where your misery was, where your ministry ought to be. And so my little boy at that time, Cameron at 8, needed some real life understanding that it isn't always about give me, I want. And so took him out on the streets of Fort Wayne. And at that time, God said to feed them, the homeless. And so we bought 75 cheeseburgers.
Oh my.
And went out to the streets of Fort Wayne and started, they weren't just people hiding out, they didn't care how much you knew until they knew how much you cared. And so feeding them, and then it just started evolving around to where we had other dads coming out with their sons and serving with us. And so one day I was driving and I asked God, I was like, dude, we have to have a name. And I heard Misfits, and I was like, that's rude, but he gave me an acronym with it, and it stands for Moving in Spiritual Fellowship, Including Those Suffering. Why does it choke me up? Because they're lost and broken people like I was, and I want them to know that Jesus loves them. So fast forward 13 years later, we are a nonprofit 501c3, and we go out every Sunday night. I have an awesome team of people. I have a really cool board, lawyers, CPAs, ex-addicts, business owners, and they support me. That the paperwork side of it's not my lane. Praise God, I have my wife that is very, very great at what she does, but we have accountability. I'm out here doing the teaching and preaching what it's like, and they're taking care of the behind the scenes type thing, so it's amazing.
Okay, your hat.
My hat is based upon two scriptures that mean a lot to me. Genesis 50:20 reads, he intended it to harm me, but God intended it for good. That's my past. Jeremiah 29:11 is, I know the plans I have for you, they're to prosper you. And so that's my future. And obviously Jesus saves, and then on the back it says Misfits. So that's a little bit about what we do.
That's awesome, Donnie. Your target audience is those who believe they have no hope, because that's where you were. And I want to pick it up as a child. I'd like you to describe your relationship with your stepfather who abused you.
My earliest memory is when we had this cow, and that cow was kind of like my animal. It was my favorite thing, but there was a lot of dysfunction with my stepfather, and he was a drinker and abusive to my mom and abusive to us that weren't his biological kids. And for some reason, I was just kind of like this target child that no matter what I did or how I did it, I was always stupid. I was always, worthless. And it just became something that I had with this cow. And one day he had that cow butchered, and he had taken me out there, and the memory I seen with that cow being hoisted up on her hind legs and screaming, and this sound that I'd never heard from her. And then when they put a bullet in her head, he said to me at that time, "If you don't change your ways, this is what's going to happen to you." And so I had a fear.
How old are you at that time, roughly?
Probably about 5 or 6.
Oh my.
Yeah, 5 or 6 years old. So it was always walking with your head down, trying to avoid the wrath of what he would go through. I had decided one day that I wasn't going to stay home because my mom worked. And so I hid in the back seat of her car, and I was like, okay, I'm going to just hide underneath these sweaters and blankets and, stay away. Well, being little and young like that, you don't really understand that creates other misery, so to speak. Mm-hmm. And they ended up finding me in the backseat of her car. He beat me half stupid.
It was at work, right?
She was at work. And
they were looking for you, and you were in her car?
Yes, hiding underneath, or the back seat under some coats that were back there. And so when I got home, he beat me up really bad. But what he did next kind of really was out there, so to speak. But he put me in a car, and he took me out in the middle of nowhere and dropped me off on a dirt road in the dark. And all I really remember is watching the taillights pull away and not understanding why I'm out here. I don't remember the ending to that part. I've kind of went through some letting things go so it don't occupy a space in my head, so to speak. But I know that there was a fear that was in me that was kind of etched in my soul, so to speak.
Did your stepfather kidnap your stepbrother by gunpoint?
He did. I have a little brother named Billy, and my mom and him separated, but he came in one night. And what I really kind of remember to the whole thing is, there was some screaming and shouting, and when myself and my 2 other brothers, there was 4 of us brothers, one was the half brother, there was the dad standing there with the gun pointing at one of us and saying, "If you call the cops or you try to find him, I will come back and kill one of your kids." And so that was the last time I seen Billy for probably 15 or so years. And then I seen him one time after that, and now I see him all the time. Well, that's my dude.
Terrific.
Okay.
Unless somebody reads the book, I don't think they could fathom the amount and the severity of the beatings that you had. It's almost, you even say in the book, it's just going to be difficult to read. But I think it helps the reader understand the torment that's going on inside you as a kid. How did you drop out of school in the 6th grade and still try to fly under the radar with your dad?
It's not that hard to do back in the day, because I'm a little older than most people nowadays. Nowadays, CPS would find you,
right.
There'd be none of that happening. But back then, in that era of life, so to speak, you could hide, and literally, you didn't have counselors hunting for you, you didn't have, caseworkers hunting for you or anything like that. And he was a school teacher, so he had, a lot of pull, so to speak. But I ran away from home when I was 13 years old. And at 13 years old, I learned to live on the streets of Los Angeles. I used to live basically surviving food-wise out of a dumpster, out of a McDonald's dumpster. And, I learned that if you kept your head down, nobody bothered you. It's a homeless community. When you're that young, you'll be sexually, physically, and mentally abused. But that was okay for me, because I wasn't being the physical abuse of fear all the time. I knew how to keep my mouth shut, so to speak, and just, do what you needed to do. I got to kind of back up just a little bit so you understand that I'd had enough of the beatings at one point, and so I was gonna, in my mind, kill that dude, the stepfather. So I lit our house on fire, and it burnt the house to the ground, but nobody died. But what it did was put me in a psychiatric hospital. And in that psychiatric hospital, they still did electric shock treatment. And so during that electric shock treatment, you know, I just never understood that pain and why this was happening. But what I did do is I just got to where I would admit to anything. I was a habitual, you know, chronic liar. I just knew to say whatever you wanted to hear. And so then I ran away from home after that.
And your mom and dad got the insurance money, right? So
Absolutely.
you didn't get quite the beating that you normally would have because they financially profited.
They made me shut up and not tell nobody nothing, you know, type thing. There is one part that was kind of, I think it's needed for this show, so to speak. While I was in that psychiatric hospital, they used to put us in what I call a convict van, you know, all tinted windows, lots of rows of seats, and they used to take us to this park, and we used to play on the weekends. Well, I'd become friends with a little black guy named Jerome. And as we're going there, Jerome would always say, hey, that's my grandma's house, that's my grandma's house. Well, Jerome left, and I escaped there and went to Jerome's house. Knocked on his door, and you know, he opened the door and goes, oh, Donnie, you got out. And I said, no, not really. You know, I escaped. And as I walked in his room, or in his front room, I noticed on the walls these pictures. And this was the very first time I had seen someone hanging on a cross. This man hanging on a cross, and I seen these candles and they were burning. First time I ever seen that. And my first response to Jerome was, hey, dude, who's that, your uncle? He said, what? You don't know Jesus? I had never even knew about Jesus. Never had even heard the name Jesus.
Oh my.
So 5 minutes later, there was another knock at the door, and they arrested me, and the grandma had called, and I went back to the psychiatric hospital. So I hated that Jesus. That Jesus now was the bad guy. That Jesus hanging on that cross had no meaning in my life no more.
So you end up back living on the streets outside of the institution, and you're 16, and you meet a girl named Shauna.
Shauna had watched me eating out of dumpsters, and she had came up to me and said, you'll never have to eat out of a dumpster again. And she befriended me. And she asked me to go to a matinee one day, and as she was coming across the street, she got hit by a car and killed right in front of me. And from then on, I turned up my anger, I turned up my hate, my rage, and from that on, there was hearing nothing from anybody that could have said anything positive to me.
She had befriended you. You were seeing each other at the diner, and you had planned to go to the movie that night, and she had befriended you, and she was not telling I think only her sister knew she was coming.
Only her sister.
And you watch her hit by that vehicle, and that pretty much hardened your heart to God.
There would have never, ever been any thought at my mind at that time that I would have a relationship like I do now with God at all. I turned off all emotions, all emotions.
How do you end up in the California Juvenile Detention Center?
Well, when you're stealing and you're doing things that are illegal and immoral, they will end up catching you. And California Youth Authority stuck me in there for a little bit of time. I tried to escape from there. That don't work very well neither. So it's just your mom is there, but she's not there. Until the writing of our book, I didn't even really know where my mom was. Those are kind of like the turmoils in your mind that I remember one time being in the youth authority that I remember them saying that she's never going to come back and see you. She moved to Indiana. You will age out is what they stated in that. But I don't really remember how that ended up. It's just one of those things that.
Are you drinking and using drugs at this age then?
I'd been drinking off of the cup since I was 7.
Wow.
My stepfather had me make these highballs. I'll never forget the name of them, bourbon and cokes. And then I was like, one day I wanted to taste it, and I tasted it, and I liked it because, see, then the beatings didn't hurt near as bad. And my mom also had this prescription bottle of stuff, and when she was in the house, I noticed she'd take one of these pills, and she was really a hyperactive lady, but all of a sudden she'd just like kind of mellow out. They were Valiums. So I started stealing Valiums from my mom and drinking off of the bourbon. It was in these brown bourbon bottles, these half-gallon ones, so you could put water in there too, so he wouldn't know how much was out of there. So I became an addict at probably 8 years old.
Oh my goodness.
Yeah.
So you're living on the streets. How do you end up in Utah?
It's crazy. Well, because I packed all my stuff and I moved to Oregon. And I met my first wife in Oregon, and she was like 8 years older than me. And I lied about everything in my life. She thought I was her age, this, that, and the other. Well, that's when we conceived our son. And I was getting in barroom fights. There was no jobs, no nothing. Well, someone told me about the oil field. And so they told me, hey, you can go out to the oil field, you can drink, you can party, but there's good money, you know, you can work hard. And so I packed everything up and moved to Oregon, or Utah, and started working on the oil fields out there. And they were right. You know, I mean, you could go to work drunk, you could do dope on the rig floor, you had parties, you know, you worked hard, you partied hard. There would be a cooler, and that'd be full of beer, full of whiskey, and so you knew that when you got off your tower, you got back in the crummy and you went back, you were drunk by the time you got home. And this is how my life started just going. And I kept going into Utah County Jail. I ended up getting a fight and punching out a undercover cop, and they don't like that very much. Nope. And so it was just chaos there. So my wife at that time ended up going back to Oregon because that's where she was from, and having the baby, having our son. So I went back up there to Oregon. And
how do you meet Pitbull?
Cocaine was what was the modern drug at that time. I was fighting in bars, I needed cocaine. I ended up meeting him through another connection, so to speak, and he liked my attitude, so to speak, and I was a fighter. I would hit you, it didn't matter. I would put a gun in your face, I didn't care. You know, I had no respect for me, let alone for you. So him and I started, he kind of investigated me a little bit. Mm-hmm. And then I started making runs for him and becoming an enforcer and collecting his monies for him that was due.
Which would mean you'd have to beat people to get it out and send a message.
Absolutely.
So you, after being vetted by Pitbull, you become his enforcer, and he's dealing, right, in cocaine. You end up having a falling out with him. What led to that?
He kind of snapped, is the best way for me to say it. You know, he kind of snapped, and I know he had killed a couple guys in the house as I was coming in up to the house, and it was like the look in his eyes, I didn't even see that look in my eyes, and it was over. I never went back to it. Mm. You know, it was just, you could tell that you would be the third one. Mm. So.
And is that when you went to Alaska?
It is.
And talk about like how you hit the ground running and what you ended up doing in Alaska.
My wife at that time had family up in Alaska, and so they'd came for some reason, I don't even remember why, but I was shooting dope in the bathroom by now. I was using a needle. I was, you know, very much heavy into drugs, and they must have known this guy named Jesus or something. I don't know, but they said, come to Alaska, you know, start all over, you know, you can have a new life and this, that, and the other. And I went up there with a thought of, maybe if I'm that far away, I can get away and quit doing drugs, do something, you know. And what I found when I got to Alaska is there's the same drugs, there's the same things, you can do the exact same things, because if nothing changes, nothing changes. And you can self-will yourself to not do them, but if you don't have a complete heart change and a relationship with Jesus Christ, it's going to come back and get you, and it did.
So you are arrested for dealing and using I think you were driving a truck and doing some dangerous things. I think you had wrecked the truck and lost the job over that. And the business owner was really trying to help you and give you another chance. He understood addiction, but addiction had a hold of you. How do you end up in the Alaska prison?
That was a guy named Jack, and I drove for an oil field company, and I did wreck that truck, and, you know, I was drunk. The crew called him. He picked me up, and that was the first time someone actually wanted to invest in my addiction, so to speak. But if you're not ready, you're not ready. And so I started doing dope again, and ended up getting into the Wildwood Correctional Facility Wildwood Correctional Facility up there. My whole brain was just focused on me, just me, you know. And even if you take a couple baby steps forward, the suck of the vacuum, so to speak, back to not trusting nobody, not caring about anybody. And no matter if I had a wife in the house with our little baby, and she had 2 little kids too, that there was this need for excitement. There was this need for, this is boring, this isn't working good, I have to listen to 3 kids screaming all the time. Just went right back out and ended up getting in trouble for theft and sales of drugs, and I went back into prison.
How long are you in the Alaska prison?
I was in there for about 3 years.
Oh my goodness.
Yeah.
And are you using in prison?
Oh yeah.
Okay.
Prisons, don't let them fool you. Nowadays, in 2018, I'm not sure, but back then we could literally throw it over the fence and pick it up and be high in the rooms. Matter of fact, the jailers were some of the guys I got drunk and high with out on the street before I got busted. So,
wow. So you get out 3 years later, and I think you get involved with a biker gang.
I did.
Probably enabled you to use, to deal, to party. But one night they strap you in a chair. Can you tell that story?
Well, what I've learned is you don't steal from the club, you know, but addiction doesn't have a name on it, so to speak. And I stole from the club, I stole some guns, and tried to, when you're high on dope, your mind just really doesn't think. You're just not thinking clear. You're thinking of the moment. You don't care what happens. We'll just put it that way. Well, they care what happens, and once they hear that you're selling their guns and stuff, they took me and they beat the fire out of me and then stuck a gun in my face, and they wanted, you know, their weaponry back, and they wanted to make an example out of me, so to speak.
Didn't they actually stick a gun in your mouth and pull the trigger?
No, I stuck my own gun in my mouth and pulled the trigger. These guys...
Did you know there wasn't a bullet in the trigger?
No, I had no idea.
Oh my goodness.
No.
That's your wanting an escape from the torment you felt yourself.
I wanted to be out. I was not going back to prison. I did not want to get beat up anymore, and I just wanted to end it. So I tried it that way once.
So do you go to California to get away from them?
I actually go to Oregon.
Okay.
So I'm in the southern part of Oregon, northern part of California. I'm married again. My wife that had my son is with another guy, and so I'm not really hanging out with him very much. I marry another lady. I had absconded, which brought detectives and, you know, the police to hunt for you after a while, and so I was...
Do you have 2 names at this time, Don?
I do, Foster and Cooper.
Okay. You're Donnie Cooper and Donnie Foster.
Right.
Depending on what you needed for an ID for,
it didn't
and a
matter.
record.
And I have a few other ones, but I won't say them because I don't know what holds them. I'm just kidding. You know, we've cleared up everything.
Okay.
Everything's good. So anyway, when I get out to Oregon, I marry another lady. One day I'm riding my bike into the yard, and as I pull in, I notice I see people over there. Well, we were on cocaine at that time, and she's like, there's nothing there. And those that have been high before, we know that we used to call them bush monsters. There's really nothing there. But I got on my bike, rode off, and came back, and she said, man, as soon as you left, 2 guys in a truck followed you. I took off for a week, out into the country. I knew how to live by the creek, so to speak. Came back, and the house was empty. And I was like walking out to my motorcycle, and at that time, As I was walking up, there was this big chrome cleaner, and I was looking in that chrome cleaner, and I seen horns, fangs, and this distorted face, and I literally turned around with my fist clenched to hit what was behind me, and it was me. I had literally become Satan in the flesh. That's how it looked to me. But at the same time, I know now what it was, but something had like snapped me out of it, and I knew at that point that there was a revival, a Pentecostal revival in town, so I was led to go down there. I had heard, I'd talked to some other people that my wife at that time got befriended by these Christian people, and I was going back to get her. So I pull up in front of that church, go in, there's this big oak doors there, and I've never even darkened the hall of a church. But I just opened that door, dirty, greasy, nasty, started walking down there. And my first response when I seen them was, man, they're all sick, because they were all bent over, you know? And I'm like, why are they all like this? And when I stood there and looked over, she looked over and gasped like that. When she did, the pastor, Bob Kirko, you always remember the good ones, said, ma'am, is that your husband? She said, yes. And he said, hallelujah. And the church started clapping. I'm like, okay, I like this. I see how this works, you know? I didn't realize that they had prophesied the night before that I'd turn my life over to care of God. And the next night, I came in and turned my life over to Christ.
You did.
I did. However, it wasn't over. I was absconded from Alaska. I still had all these warrants. I had different things. But God is a God of direction. God is a God of love. But I tell people like this, when I came to God, you come like a hog farmer, so to speak, and you give God all your big hogs, the 500-pound addictions, the anger, the porn, the hurt, the habits, the hang-ups. But as I was sweeping out the stables, I seen this one little brand new cute piglet. And that cute piglet for me was weed. I had to have that weed. You know, it's natural, it isn't gonna hurt nothing. But fast forward.
That's what you were thinking.
Mitch has an unbelievable ability to take the words of the Bible, the word that God gives us, and make it very real and very practical. And that's exactly what he did in this book. He took my story and used it for good, for God's good. And I know he did it with a lot of other stories. I read this book and I think it's just amazing. And I think it has a real and very tangible way that it can impact your life. So I hope that you get a chance to read the book. It's an amazing read, Street Smarts from Proverbs by Mitch Kruse.